Asmita lived in a small tin house on a small piece of land in a small town in eastern Nepal. 5 people lived in the house: her father, mother, grandmother, Asmita, and Asmita's little brother. Many families grow their own food on the land around their houses in Nepal, but the piece of land around Asmita's house was too small to grow enough food to feed her family. So Asmita's parents had to work extra hard to feed the family. They had never gone to school, so they couldn't read or write. They had never studied to work as a bus driver or a plumber or a teacher, so they worked with their hands. Sometimes they carried bricks or dug ditches. Other times they planted and harvested crops. After a long day of work, Asmita's father and mother were tired when they came home. They wanted to relax. They tried to relax by drinking alcohol. But when they drank, they began to fight. The more they fought, the more they drank. Soon, Asmita's parents seemed to be drinking and fighting all the time. Neighbors heard the fighting and came to the small tin house to try to help. Then the leaders of the town tried to help. Even the police came and tried to help, but nothing changed. Asmita's father and mother kept drinking and fighting. Then her mother left. She got tired of drinking and fighting. She wanted a better life. She moved away to India to work. Asmita was left at home. Now only 4 people lived in the small house. Asmita was put in charge of the house. She cooked the meals and cleaned up. It was hard work. It was difficult living with her father. He kept on drinking. When he drank, there was no peace at home. It seemed like life would never get better. Then Asmita's grandmother started going to church on Sabbath. Asmita had never heard about church, but her grandmother was happy when she returned home from church on Sabbath. Asmita liked to see her smile. Her grandmother told her stories about the God of heaven whom she had heard about at church. Asmita had never heard of this God. Her family worshipped gods of stone and wood. Asmita liked the stories. One Sabbath, Asmita decided to go to church with her grandmother. She left her housework and took her little brother by the hand. They went to church together. Other children warmly welcomed Asmita to the children's Sabbath school. The teacher gave her a big smile. Asmita immediately knew that she wanted to go to church every Sabbath. Today, Asmita is 12 years old, and every week she sings songs and recites Bible verses in Sabbath school. She is so happy. Life has become so much better with God. Every Sabbath, Asmita asks her father to come to church too, and she is praying that he will agree. I think that if Father comes to church, he will stop drinking and we will have peace at home, she said. Part of this quarter's 13th Sabbath offering will help establish a school where children like Asmita can study in eastern Nepal. Thank you for planning a generous 13th Sabbath offering.
Well, we enjoyed a beautiful, beautiful sunrise with the yards and trees all being white, right? And you know what I liked about it best? The driveways and sidewalks and roads were still black. So, if we could just figure that out all the time. When it snows, stay in the grass and stay in the trees. Stay off the road, stay off the sidewalks. But it worked out this time, and that was great. And happy birthday to your mom. She was born on the same day as my father-in-law. Tomorrow's his birthday. I wonder if they're the same age. Probably not. Since you're quite a bit younger than me, your mom is probably quite a bit younger than my father-in-law. And well, as we get started today, do you have a favorite book of the Bible? Kind of. Yes. Psalms. Psalms is a fantastic book of the Bible, isn't it? You just keep on digging and learning and growing in that book. Anything else? Yes. Job. Fantastic book of the Bible. The first book of the Bible written before Genesis. Did you know that? So the earliest book of the Bible. What else? I saw another hand. Genesis. Well, I'm glad you mentioned Genesis. That's where I'm going to start today. So many different books. What else? Yes. Proverbs. A fantastic book of wisdom. John, the disciple that Jesus continued to love. It says John the Beloved, the disciple that Jesus continued to love in spite of who he was. And did I see another hand or two? The Bible is so full of riches. And Genesis starts off with the foundation that the entire rest of the Bible is built upon. The presentation of who God is and how we came to be. The book of Genesis has 50 chapters. It wasn't written in 50 chapters, but it got divided into 50 chapters. In it, we're told the story of how our world came to be. God created it in how many days? 6 or 7. Well, both answers are correct. He worked to create everything that we see in the first 6 days, and the seventh day he capped it off. The whip topping and the cherry. The seventh day, always the reminder of who God is, the one who loves us, the one who created us, and the day set aside for all eternity to spend time with God, growing in our relationship with him. In the book of Genesis, we're told about Adam and Eve and their disobedience, and through that, the infecting of our entire world with sin and with death. We're told of the world becoming more and more evil as time went by, and ultimately resulting in the flood that took away everyone on earth except one family. How many got on the ark? How many people got on the ark? 8 people got on the ark. I was talking with with someone yesterday, Noah and Mrs. Noah. We don't know her name, do we? And we don't know the names of any of the ladies that were on the ark. Genesis then tells us about a man named Abram. His name ended up being changed to Abraham, and his wife Sarah, that's what her name was changed to as well, and how God called Abraham to take his family and move to a new land, a promised land that God would show him. And we're told about God's promise that he would have a son who would ultimately, through that son and that family, grow into a nation numbering like the stars of the night sky. But through them, the Messiah, the Savior of the world, would be born. In Genesis, we learn about the mistakes of Abraham. We learn about the lessons that he learned. We learn about his son, we learn about his grandsons, and then the last fourth of the book focuses on his great-grandsons, and most specifically, his great-grandson Joseph. And that's where we're going to begin this morning. In Genesis 37, verse 2, it opens with this story, and I'm reading from the New Living Translation. That's what's going to be on the screen today. This is the account of Jacob and his family. When Joseph was 17 years old, how old? When he was 17 years old, he often tended his father's flocks. He worked for his half-brothers, the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. But Joseph reported to his father some of the bad things his brothers were doing. You've heard the story, right? How many brothers did Joseph have? 11. He had 11 brothers. He was the next to the youngest, and it sounds like he wasn't doing a very good job of building good relationships with those brothers. Yeah, he's the tattletale. Look out. Joseph is watching. Yeah, he's not the favorite among them. The little spoiled brat. And his dad wasn't helping with that matter either, was he? In verse 3, Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age and from his favorite wife. Yeah. I don't have that problem. Both my kids were born from my favorite wife. When you have only one, that makes things a whole lot simpler. So one day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph. And you know what it was, right? Someone under the age of 18. What was that special gift? A robe. Were you under 18? A robe, what color was it? All kind of colors. And his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. And they couldn't even say a nice thing about the guy. And do you know about the dreams he had? Yeah. One day he had a dream and he told his brothers about it. Probably another mistake. He said, we were out in the field. We were tying bundles of grain. And suddenly my bundle stood up. And all your bundles bowed down to my bundle. Okay, read between the lines. Do you know how to interpret dreams? Yeah, they didn't either, but they knew. What are you saying, Joseph? We're going to bow down to you? Yeah, right. Yeah, like that's going to ever happen. And they hated him all the more. Soon Joseph had another dream, and again he told his brothers about it. This time he told his dad about it too. He said, I had another dream. The sun, the moon, and 11 stars. He got the right number there. It doesn't take much to figure it out. And 11 stars bowed low before me. And you know how that one went over. And Joseph's dad had a few words with him. Joseph, will you keep your mouth shut? You're not helping matters either. Yeah, Dad, but thanks for this nice coat you gave me. The brothers hated him, attributed it to his big head and his spoiled brat status. And the dad, though, thought, what is this? Why is Joseph having these kind of dreams? Is there something to it? Not long after these dreams, the brothers were out with the large flocks of sheep that they had and searching for places to keep them fed and grazing. And they were gone for a longer amount of time than Dad expected, so he said, Joseph, head out, find them. See how they're doing, bring a report back to me. So Joseph headed out. It took a little bit of time for him to kind of trace the steps and find out where they were, but he found them. And when Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they started talking among themselves and said, this is our opportunity to get rid of him. Let's just kill him and get it over with. Wow. Have your brothers and sisters ever talked about killing you? Well, if they did, they probably didn't tell you about it. Have you ever thought about killing them? No, this is radical. But when Reuben, the oldest brother, heard the conversation and what was going on, he says, guys, let's not kill him. Let's not any of us take the blame for his death. The empty well here, there's no water in it. Let's just chunk him down the hole and he'll die down there and we'll be done with it. So that's what they did. He shows up and they said, hey, how you doing? They probably punched him a few times, knocked him down, took his coat. Come on, guys, come on, stop. What are you doing? And they drop him down the well and he can't get out. And a little bit later, they see a caravan of camels coming their way. They take a look, and it's a group of Ishmaelite Traders. What are Ishmaelites? They are descendants from a guy called Ishmael. You ever heard of Ishmael? Ishmael was the oldest son of their great-great-grandfather, which means they're cousins, right? This caravan of traders are their cousins. Do you have any cousins that are several generations apart? Yeah, Perry's one of mine. So if I decide I want to sell my kid, I'll look up him, right? Just keep it in the family. So they sold him. They said, Judah came up. Reuben seems to have been away at the time, gone to do something. The caravan shows up. Judah says, hey, why don't we get rid of him? We don't have to kill him. He'll be gone from us, and we'll all get a little bit of pocket change. Let's sell him. And that's what they did. They sold him to their cousins who took him to Egypt. And they sold him there as a slave. Who bought him? Do you remember the name? Potiphar. Potiphar, the guy who was in charge of of Pharaoh's palace guard. Pharaoh, the name that they call the king in Egypt. Potiphar, a bigwig, bought Joseph. And I want to point out something to you. There is no justifying what Joseph's brothers did. Is there? No justification at all. Well, at least they didn't kill him. Well, okay, that's nice. But there's no justification at all. Slavery may have been accepted in their society, but that didn't make it right, did it? God never condones oppression and slavery. In fact, let's just say it straight. It's a sin. It's an egregious sin. The next chapters in Genesis tell the amazing story of Joseph, becoming so completely trusted by Potiphar that Potiphar put him in charge of everything he owned, everything he had. But time went by, and Jacob was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife. You know that story. And Potiphar knew it was a lie, but he had to save face. And he had Joseph put into prison. And that's just not right. Joseph is really getting the short end of the stick here, isn't he? He's favorite of his dad. His brothers sell him into slavery. He becomes favorite of his owner, Potiphar. Potiphar's wife lies. He gets thrown into jail. In jail, he became so trusted by the prison warden that the warden put Joseph in charge of everything. The warden had a cushy job then. Joseph is taking care of everything. The warden's getting paid. Joseph's a prisoner. But a prisoner in not a bad place. We learn about Joseph telling a couple of the prisoners what their dreams meant. And what he said was going to happen happened exactly like he said, right? And then we're told that the Pharaoh had a dream, and he wondered what it was. And one of the guys whose dream had been interpreted and explained by Joseph said, I know a guy who can tell you. He's the head guy at the prison. Well, he's a prisoner, but he's really the head guy there. Does a good job. And so Joseph is brought, and he tells the king about the vision. And let's pick up in Genesis 41, verse 39. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to you, clearly no one else is as intelligent or wise as you are. Plus, he had a real good resume, didn't he? In charge of the prison, in charge of Potiphar's house. You will be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on the throne, will have rank higher than yours. Wow. Let's keep going. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand, and he placed it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in fine linen clothing and hung a gold chain around his neck. Then he had Joseph ride in the chariot reserved for his second in command. And wherever Joseph went, the command was shouted, "Kneel down!" So Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of all Egypt, and Pharaoh said to him, "I am Pharaoh, but no one will lift a hand or foot in the entire land of Egypt without your approval." Is this a fairy tale? Sounds like one. Sounds like one. And they lived happily ever after, right? It's not a fairy tale. This is the absolute truth of what happened. When do kings, whether they're called Pharaoh or Caesar or whatever, when do they pick somebody that's a prisoner, pull them out, and make them second in command over the entire nation? Does it happen? History says it does. I'm just finishing up reading the book, Ancient Egyptians for Dummies. I bought a book some years ago called Games for the Superintelligent at a yard sale. And lots of fun little mental challenges. I love the book. It was 50 cents. And so I bought it. But what the guy said to me was worth far more than the 50 cents. I loved it. I put the book down and handed him 50 cents. He says, "Games for the Superintelligent. Who are you getting this for? I can tell by looking at you it's not for you." Yeah, so I've started reading the books for dummies. On page 36 and 37 of this book, let me read to you what it says. Scribes, a scribe was someone that was educated, knew how to write, knew mathematics, could run a business. Scribes were the ones who took care of the everyday organization of what's going on in the various businesses around the country, around Egypt. Okay? Scribes who showed particular talent and skill could rise even to the position of vizier. Joseph was a scribe. He ran Potiphar's house. Joseph was a scribe. He ran the prison. They could rise even to the position of vizier, which is second only to the king. I'm reading from this book. The vizier's role was powerful and diverse. The entire palace and its internal operations were under the vizier's control. The vizier was also responsible for the safety of the king and the security of Egypt, which meant the police force was also under the vizier's control. In addition, the vizier presided over the legal court. In legal matters, the vizier acted as judge, sentencing and administering punishments on behalf of the king. Does that sound like the position Joseph got put into? When we read and the story continues, that's an exact description of who Joseph was, confirmed by archaeologists, confirmed by historians. This was something that was done. And the Bible tells us Joseph was one of them. The Bible story of Joseph and his role in Egypt perfectly fits this description. Joseph was a vizier. Did you know that? Now you do. Joseph was a vizier. That's what the Egyptians called him. The story continues. Joseph had told the Pharaoh that his dream was foretelling 7 years of bumper crops and then 7 years of famine. And he said, during these 7 years of bumper crops, take the excess, store it, preserve it, because you're going to need it during the next 7 years. And so that's what they did, and Joseph was in charge of that. The years of famine were far beyond Egypt, though. Hundreds of miles beyond Egypt, this famine was impacting everyone. And soon from people all around were coming to Egypt trying to find food for their families. That's when one day Joseph recognized 10 fellows. Who was it? 10 of his brothers, everyone except his younger brother Benjamin. If you're not familiar with what happened, read Genesis 42 through 45, and it tells you all the story of what took place there. As chapter 45 ends, Joseph lets his brothers know who he is, and he asks about his dad. And they were scared. But yes, Dad is still alive. So Joseph says, go, get Dad, get all your families, and bring them here. I'll make sure that you are taken care of. I will put you up. Wow. Wow. Still sounds like a fairy tale, doesn't it? But it was real. It was true. But in chapter 50, Dad dies. And now the brothers get really worried. Genesis 50, verse 15 says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, perhaps Joseph will hate us and may actually repay us for all the evil which we did for him. So they sent messengers to Joseph saying, before your father died, he commanded, saying, thus you shall say to Joseph, I beg you, please forgive the trespasses of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. Now please forgive the trespasses of the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Why do you think Joseph cried? I think there were two reasons. His dad died. And they don't even know he already fully forgave him. They don't trust that Joseph has really let it go. They do not know the heart of love that he really has. And both of these were cause for agony and heartache and tears. Then his brothers also went and fell down before his face, and they said, behold, we are your servants. And now this is the point I want us to get to today. Verse 19 in chapter 50. Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. Wow. Can God use bad for good? That's the title of today's sermon, and I'll ask it several times. Can God bring good from bad? Can God use bad for good? Yeah, obviously he can, because God knew what his brothers were going to do long before they ever did it, right? He knew what the future was going to be. That's what those dreams were about. He knew. It was wrong, and it was bad, but God had a plan. Selling Joseph was an egregious sin, but God was going to forgive them and actually turn their evil deed into the very thing that saved them and their families. Could God have saved them in another way? Sure. God could have saved them in another way. But God in his wisdom let things play out the way they were going to play out to show his ability in all situations to rescue and save. God can use bad for good. He's done it for 6,000 years. It doesn't make it right, what Joseph did. Absolutely not. Their actions were inexcusable. Not unforgivable, but inexcusable. Right? Abuse and oppression are evil, and it's a sin, no matter who is oppressing who. Then the book of Exodus, you turn the page from chapter 50, you're in Exodus 1, and it jumps 400 years ahead. Now, all the descendants of these brothers, and probably all the descendants of Joseph, have been forced into slavery by Pharaoh. You might say, well, what goes around comes around. But 400 years later, not a single one of those people, 15, 20 generations later, had anything to do with Joseph being sold into slavery, did they? They didn't have a thing to do with it. Yet the world continues, and evil happens, and oppression of one against others continues. And get this also, Satan knew the promise to Abraham that through his children would come the Savior of the world, right? So he thinks, let's just make them a bunch of nobody slaves that have no influence in the world at all, and we'll take care of that. You see, from the time Satan knew what God was going to do, become a human here on earth, he did everything he could to stop it from happening, because if it happened, he might just lose the battle. What were some other ways that he tried to stop it from happening? What's that? Evil practice everywhere. In fact, they became so evil before the flood that it resulted in the flood and the destruction of the world. And God's miracle that we've already mentioned today of Noah and his family, God brought about the salvation of all humanity through that. And then King Herod hears about a baby being born. And what does he do? Kill all the little ones. Kill all those babies. Kill them. 2 years and younger. Let's make sure we get this guy, whoever it is and whatever they're trying to find out. God has a plan. Abused and oppressed, treated as nobodies, God still had a plan for the Israelites. Can God use bad for good? Always. But that doesn't justify and excuse the wrong. Just because God can bring good from bad doesn't make bad okay. And it doesn't make it not so bad. It's still wrong. Slavery had been a part of human history for several thousand years. Long before written history, I've read. From the earliest periods of recorded history, slavery was found in the world's most advanced regions. Slavery in the United States was not unique, treating humans like animals. Archaeologists have found evidence of slavery in ancient Assyria, in Babylon, in China, in Egypt, which we just referred to, in India, in Persia, in Mesopotamia, in classical Greek and in Rome, in Africa, in the Islamic world, and even among North American Indians. Did you know that? Slavery has been a part of the evil of this world, all around the world, for thousands of years. At the time of Jesus, I looked it up, there were probably between 2 and 3 million slaves in Italy alone. In Italy alone, making up 35 to 40% of the population of Italy at the time of Jesus were slaves. England's Doomsday Book, written in 1086, indicates that 10% of the population of England at that time were slaves. And among some Indian tribes here in America, nearly a quarter of the population, 25%, were slaves. The modern word for slave comes from the word Slav. What is Slav? During the Middle Ages, most slaves in Europe and the Islamic world were people of the Slavic, Eastern European population. In Athens, during the classical period, a third to a half of the population were slaves. Most slaves were white, coming from areas of Eastern Europe or of the Black Sea. And it was only in the 15th century, the 1400s, that slavery became linked to people from sub-Saharan Africa. Yet in 4 fundamental ways, the New World slavery differed from most previous slavery. These are the ways that slavery changed in the 1400s and the 1500s and continued to get worse. Slavery in the classical and early medieval worlds was not based on racial distinctions. Anybody could be a slave. And that was true even as time went by. But sadly, it became far more common that it was the darker skinned that became the slaves. Number two, the ancient world didn't necessarily regard slavery as a permanent condition. You're just a slave for a while and then you're free. Slaves did not necessarily hold the lowest status in society. There were people who were lower class than slaves. In fact, in classical Greece, a lot of the teachers, the educators, the scholars, the poets, even doctors were slaves. Wow. It would sure help medical bills if we could all have a doctor as a slave, right? No, let's not. Let's all take care of each other. Number four, it was only in the New World that slavery provided the labor force for high-pressure, profit-making capitalist system. And the plantations began with cotton, sugar, coffee, cocoa being produced to ship out and sell in distant markets so that the owners of these plantations could become filthy rich. And hereditary slavery extending over several generations was really rare before this time. The Bible allowed for slavery, but the term did not mean ownership of another person. Did you know that? When the Bible allows for slavery, it doesn't mean you own somebody else. In Bible times, slavery described a person who was indebted to another, working off their debt. And no term of service could last more than 6 years. The 7th year came, and you were set free. No matter how big your debt was, you were set free, and it was paid off. So if you owed $2 or $3 million to somebody and you couldn't pay it, you could become their slave for 6 years, and at the end of 6 years, you were free to go. You know, it's interesting how God is the one who established that for the Israelite nation. 6, and then the 7th is something special. That's the way God does things. There could be a whole sermon on that one. This is Black History Month, and we all know that the slavery of black Africans from the 1400s into the 1800s was a most evil and despicable crime. Inexcusable. Yet in spite of the inhumane treatment of those enslaved, God can bring good from the bad, and He has. Our country is blessed today because of the contribution of many, many, hundreds and thousands of those who were once slaves or are the descendants of those who were once slaves. And we are blessed because of it. Names like George Washington Carver, Booker T. Washington, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Abraham Galloway, do you know that name? Lot Carey, Martin Luther King Jr., do you know these three names? Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Mary Jackson. Do you know those names? Several of you are nodding your head. They made a movie about it. That's how I came to know them. Called Hidden Figures. Yeah, an amazing story. These ladies who were the front line and the astronauts knew it and trusted them. They have to be there helping to figure out the calculations to keep us alive. The list could go on and on. I learned a new name in the past couple of weeks, Phyllis Wheatley. In my email letter a couple of weeks ago, or last week, I told you her name, and I shared the ending of a 132-line poem that she wrote, a poem called Thoughts on Works and Providence, and I'm not going to put that on the screen today for you. You can look back up and read it with her poetry about God and His creation and how she sees it. She was, excuse me, she was born in Africa about 1753, and she was captured and sold into slavery in Boston in 1961. She was only 18 years old. Not 18, let's get this straight. She was only 8 years old when she was bought in Boston. She was a small, sick child who caught the attention of John and Susanna Wheatley. They bought her as a domestic servant for Susanna, someone to work in the house, and they gave her a name. The ship that she came on was the Phyllis, so they called her Phyllis, and their last name became her last name. Susanna soon discovered that Phyllis was a really, really fast learner. She was a bright kid. And so she said, yeah, you don't need to work so much. Do a few things. Instead, we're going to educate you, which was not something that was normally done. And so Susanna, with the help of her daughter, educated Phyllis. Phyllis enjoyed writing poetry, and she began publishing her poems by the time she was 12 years old. She became known locally for her poetry. And in 1773, Phyllis, in continuously poor health, set off for London, just 20 years old, with her master's son, Nathaniel. It was here that she was not only accepted, but adored, both for her poise and her literary work, and the people were just amazed by her and loved her. It was also here in London that she met Selina Hastings, the Countess of Huntington, a friend of Susanna Wheatley's. And the Countess was impressed with the poetry that she saw that Phyllis had written. And so she sponsored, paid for a book to be printed. Poems on various subjects, religious and moral. And with this publication, Phyllis became the first American slave, the first person of American descent, and only the third colonial American woman to have her work published. In late 1773, just as her book was coming off the press, Phyllis traveled back to Boston because Susanna, they got word, had become quite sick, and she went back to help take care of her. She was freed about this time, but freedom in 1774 in Boston proved incredibly difficult. Even with her literary popularity, the years after the trip to London were extremely difficult. Most of the Wheatley family died over the next 4 years. And Phyllis was unable to sell any of her writings and unable to find anyone to sponsor the publication of another book that she could sell. But there were glimmers of happiness in her life. She married John Peters in 1778, a free black man, and the couple probably had 3 children, although the number is uncertain because we really don't know much about the details of her life after 1778. It's believed that none of her children lived past infancy. The couple struggled with extreme poverty, and in 1785, John was put in jail because of his debt. And that makes a lot of sense, right? You're too poor to pay off your debt, so let's just put you in jail. Phyllis continued to write on subjects of varying biblical themes and the horrors of slavery, but she wasn't able to support herself with these writings, and a lot of those writings have been lost. And then on December 5, 1785, Phyllis was just 31. She and her baby died the same day. But her poetry lives. And as I've read some of her poetry, it's touched my heart. One of them, she was, before 1773, before going to London, a fellow by the name of Thomas Woolridge, a British businessman and supporter of a fellow by the name of William Legge, the Earl of Dartmouth. He asked her to write a poem for Legge to honor him. He had just been appointed Secretary of State for all the colonies. So the poem she wrote ended up being put into the collection of printed writings a year later, and so I'm thankful for that. The poem was entitled, "The Right Honorable William, Earl of Dartmouth." And the poem reflects the colonists' hopes that Dartmouth would be less tyrannical than his predecessor was. In it, she describes that her love for freedom comes from being a slave and describes being kidnapped from her parents, comparing the colony's relationship with England to a slave's relationship to the slaveholder. It speaks to my heart, and I share a few lines of it with you from the middle of the poem. Should you, my Lord, writing to the new appointee, should you, my Lord, while you peruse my song, wonder from whence my love of freedom sprung, whence flow these wishes for the common good, by feeling hearts alone best understood, I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Afric's fancy happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest, what sorrows labor in my parents' breast. Steeled was that soul, and by no misery moved, that from my father seized his babe beloved. Such my case, and can I then but pray others may never feel tyrannic sway? I can't imagine anyone who could snatch a child from their parents, take her across an ocean and sell her into slavery. It's beyond my comprehension. But it happened hundreds of thousands of times. Can God use bad for good? Phyllis Wheatley said yes in her most famous poem and published in her book. Titled On Being Brought from Africa to America, this is her poem. 'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God and there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join angelic train. Yes. She says yes, just like Joseph. God can bring good from bad. Joseph said God knew what he was doing. He allowed evil to happen. It doesn't excuse it. But God brought good from it. And let's look for that good, and let's have our hearts open to the good that can come. And I expect to see Phyllis Wheatley in heaven. And I want to be her friend. Where there will be no more sickness, no more sorrow, no more death, no more abuse of each other. Her life didn't turn out like Joseph's, sounding like a fairy tale. But nonetheless, with her writing and from her heart, she's touched thousands of lives. How I long for that day, I and millions more. I close with one more poem, this one written by Howard Thurman. Thurman was born in 1899. He was raised in the segregated South. He's recognized as one of the great spiritual leaders of the 20th century, renowned for his reflections on humanity. His reflections on humanity and our relationship with God. He didn't live the dramatic public activism of Martin Luther King Jr., and in fact, critics called him a backbencher. What's a backbencher? A backbencher in the civil movement, being more preoccupied with mystical meanings than frontline protesting. But Thurman countered that the first order of social change was changing one's individual internal spirit. And that's the way Christianity works, isn't it? You can't change the world by changing the government. You change the world by letting God change your heart. This poem expresses that spirit that Thurman presented. Lord, Lord, open unto me light for my darkness. Open unto me courage for my fear. Open unto me hope for my despair. Open unto me peace for my turmoil. Open unto me joy for my sorrow. Open unto me strength for my weakness. Open unto me wisdom for my confusion. Open unto me forgiveness for my sins. Open unto me tenderness for my toughness. Open unto me love for my hates. Open unto me thyself for myself. Lord, Lord, open unto me.